The Death Korps of Krieg fields some of the most specialized and disturbing military formations in the entire Imperium. From cavalry that murders in complete silence to engineers who spend months digging tunnels beneath enemy fortifications to chemical weapon units operating in environments that would kill normal soldiers in seconds. Today I'm breaking down 12 of the most iconic Krieg regiments, from the smallest specialized units to massive siege armies that prosecuted campaigns lasting decades. Starting with a unit so specialized that its very existence raises a question: what kind of army needs dedicated chemical reconnaissance? Chemical Corps, the Death Korps. Chemical Corps combines chemical detection expertise with offensive chemical weapons deployment, operating in environments so toxic that standard Imperial Guard units would die within minutes. Before you dismiss this as standard hazmat protocol, understand that Krieg engineers are authorized to deploy highly corrosive gases during assaults, using clouds designed to melt through armor and flesh alike. This capability builds directly on Krieg's expertise with toxic environments inherited from their post-atomic homeworld. Krieg itself features radioactive contamination across most of its surface, creating conditions where standard Imperial Guard respirators prove completely insufficient. All Krieg soldiers, save vehicle crews, wear advanced respirator units filtering out particles that would incapacitate troops from other regiments. The Chemical Corps weaponizes this baseline protection, turning environmental hazards into tactical advantages. The Imperium maintains restrictions on chemical warfare, viewing such weapons as distasteful at best and potentially heretical depending on compounds involved. But Krieg operates under different standards, having earned special dispensation through 5 centuries of civil war where victory required every possible advantage. The Chemical Corps exists because sometimes you need soldiers who can walk into a cloud of nerve gas, identify its composition, and respond with something even worse. But if you think chemical warfare represents Krieg's most disturbing tactical capability, wait until you see their cavalry formations. Death Riders. Most cavalry are noble warriors on majestic steeds, charging into battle with banners flying and war cries echoing across the field. Death Riders are none of those things. They ride genetically engineered monstrosities that barely resemble horses anymore, advance in total silence except for the clatter of talons on rubble, and slaughter without a single cheer or taunt until nothing remains but corpses and quiet. Let me explain what makes these things so disturbing. Krieg mounts aren't horses. They're what happens when you take a horse and redesign it specifically for trench warfare on an irradiated hellscape. The physique is far stronger than any normal horse. The hind legs can clear entire trenches in a single leap, and the feet are splayed out like some evolutionary nightmare specifically adapted for moving through thick mud and in over rubble without getting stuck. These aren't noble steeds, they're bioengineered killing machines that look like someone described a horse to an engineer who had never seen one and only cared about functionality. And the riders themselves are just as eerie. Each one carries a hunting lance that only works when charging, but when it connects, it hits with devastating strength and armor penetration that can punch through reinforced plating. They move 10 inches per turn with weapon skill 3+ and toughness 4, meaning they're reasonably survivable and genuinely dangerous in close combat. But it's not the stats that make them terrifying. It's the absolute silence. No battle cries, no taunts, no cheering. Just the methodical slaughter of everything in front of them until the only sound left is nothing, which is definitely not the vibe you get from the tanks, but at least they make noise. The 1st Armored Regiment has a completely different approach to killing people. 1st Armored Regiment. Most Imperial Guard regiments treat tanks like cavalry, breakthrough weapons that punch through lines and flank the enemy before they know what hit them. Krieg treats them like artillery that can move. The 1st Armored Regiment deploys Lehman Russ battle tanks as their primary platform, each one carrying a 6-person crew: commander, driver, main gunner, loader, and 2 sponson gunners when the heavy weapons are mounted. The frontal armor is thick enough to shrug off most anti-tank fire as long as you keep the thick side pointed at the enemy, and that's about all you need to know. The turret weapon swaps between battle cannon for standard fire support, twin-linked Lascannon when you need to kill armor specifically, or the Demolisher variant that turns a tank into a close-range bunker destroyer. Here's the thing, while Cadian mechanized regiments use armor for rapid maneuver warfare and flanking operations, Krieg armor doctrine emphasizes fire support rather than breakthrough. The tanks stay with the infantry. They advance under rolling artillery barrages, providing direct fire against enemy positions while guardsmen move across no man's land. The armor doesn't exploit gaps or conduct independent operations. It parks itself where the infantry needs fire support and delivers accurate, devastating firepower until the position falls. This reflects Krieg's 500-year civil war, where victory came from superior firepower and willingness to absorb casualties, not clever tactics or breakthrough maneuvers. maneuvers. The 1st Armored Regiment embodies that philosophy. Their Lehman Russ crews understand that armor serves the infantry, not the other way around. When the whistles blow and guardsmen climb out of the trenches, those tanks move forward with them, delivering fire support from positions where lighter vehicles would get shredded. But if you think patient armor support is methodical, wait until you meet the cavalry that doesn't make a sound. 19. Livery Regiment. Most Krieg regiments wear the same grim colors: dark grays, somber greens, black shoulder pads. The 143rd rocks blue jackets. But the 19th Livery Regiment operates in full desert tan, and before you ask, yes, it's because they fight in deserts. Here's the thing: Krieg regimental colors aren't standardized because Krieg High Command sat down and designed a fashion line. They vary based on whatever cloth and dye supplies are available when a regiment gets raised. The homeworld is a frozen radioactive wasteland where nothing grows, so they make do with what they can scavenge or import. Most regiments end up in variations of gray, black, or green because those are the easiest dyes to produce in bulk. The 19th got desert tan because they were heading to arid hellholes, where blue jackets would make you a visible target from 3 kilometers out. The 19th represents environmental specialization. The Death Corps aren't just trench warriors grinding through frozen mud and under artillery fire. They bring their grim methodology to every climate the Imperium throws at them. Scorching deserts with toxic sandstorms? Fine. Radioactive wastelands where the air melts your lungs? Perfect. Planets where the atmosphere eats through standard guard equipment in hours? Even better, because every Krieg soldier already wears advanced respirator gear designed to filter out environmental hazards that would kill anyone else. Those respirators that make them look like World War I nightmare fuel. They work just as well filtering toxic desert dust as they do filtering radioactive ash. The sealed protective gear that keeps Krieg soldiers alive on their frozen homeworld? Equally effective against biological hazards, chemical weapons, and extreme heat. So the 19th shows up to desert sieges already equipped to handle atmospheric conditions that would require other guard regiments to requisition specialized gear they don't have training for. It turns out, when your entire civilization spent 500 years fighting across a planet you deliberately turned into an uninhabitable radioactive wasteland, you get extremely good at operating in environments where the air itself wants to kill you. But at least the 19th gets to see the sun occasionally, unlike the poor bastards who form Krieg's most specialized combat formation. Combat engineers. Without combat engineers, there is no Krieg siege. The trenches, the tunnels, the fortress reductions, all of it depends on these soldiers spending weeks or months underground digging toward enemy lines with nothing but picks, shovels, and the absolute certainty they're going to die down there. And I can prove it. The Death Corps combat engineers are elite demolitions experts and sappers who are specializing in subterranean warfare. During prolonged sieges, they dig tunnels toward enemy lines for weeks, sometimes months, using specialized equipment to detect and defeat enemy countermining operations. The Mole launcher fires burrowing missiles through sap channels that are remotely guided before detonation. Imagine sitting in a fortified bunker, hearing something moving under your feet, and then the entire floor explodes. But here's where it gets brutal. Krieg combat engineers are armed with heavy carapace armor, explosives, mines, gas grenades, flamethrowers, and heavy-duty combat shotguns loaded with specialized ammunition. Those shotguns are devastating in confined spaces. Point-blank range. Enclosed tunnels, nowhere to run. The stopping power is absolute. You're not dodging, you're not taking cover, you're just dead. The claustrophobic horror of tunnel warfare is the foundation of everything Krieg does. How combat engineers spend entire deployments in pitch-black underground corridors, breathing recycled air, waiting for the enemy to break through or the ceiling to collapse. Countermining operations mean both sides are digging toward each other, listening through the rock, trying to blow the other tunnel first. And when the tunnels meet, it's flamethrowers and shotguns in spaces so tight you can't even swing a sword. Without these soldiers, the Death Corps can't breach fortifications or bypass defensive lines. The entire siege doctrine collapses without engineer support. That's why they get the best armor and the most dangerous assignments. But if you think underground warfare is intense, wait until you hear about the soldiers whose entire job is throwing grenades until something explodes. Grenadiers. Among soldiers who've already accepted death as spiritual obligation, what does it take to be considered elite? Turns out being willing to die isn't enough. You have to be willing to die first. Krieg, grenadiers are selected from veteran guardsmen based on specialized tactical skills rather than traditional rank advancement. You don't get promoted to grenadier because you survived long enough. You get selected because you demonstrated the specific capabilities required for the worst jobs in the entire Death Corps arsenal, which is saying something. Intensive training emphasizes close quarters combat, rapid assault tactics, and increased combat effectiveness through specialized equipment. These are the soldiers who go first into the breach, who lead the charge across no man's land, who enter enemy enemy trenches and clear them room by room with flamers and grenades. A typical grenadier squad consists of 10 soldiers, a sergeant, flamer trooper, grenade launcher operator, and 7 additional grenadiers equipped for close quarters work. The flamer handles bunker clearing and trench sanitation, which is a polite way of saying he burns people alive in enclosed spaces. The grenade launcher drops explosives into enemy positions before the squad advances. The remaining 7 carry laser guns, bayonets, grenades, and the absolute certainty they're walking into something horrible. Unlike Imperial Guard grenadiers from other regiments who might emphasize tactical finesse, Krieg grenadiers are about overwhelming close-range firepower and absolute commitment to the assault. No clever flanking maneuvers, no sophisticated combined arms tactics. You identify the enemy position, you advance under artillery cover, and you don't stop advancing until either the position is taken or everyone is dead. The equipment loadout reflects this assault-focused doctrine. Flamers for bunker clearing, grenade launchers for suppression, heavy carapace armor for the brief additional seconds of survivability it provides when advancing through concentrated enemy fire. Every piece of equipment serves the single purpose of getting these soldiers close enough to enemy positions to deploy their close quarters weapons before dying, which they will, but at least grenadiers get specialized equipment and elite status recognition. The 127th Infantry Regiment gets standard issue everything and the privilege of holding whatever ground the grenadiers just captured. 127th Infantry Regiment. The 127th Infantry Regiment is the backbone. Thousands of faceless soldiers marching through trenches, absorbing fire, digging in, and dying without complaint. This is where the cult of sacrifice lives most prominently, in rank and file guardsmen who simply march forward into fire because that's what Krieg does. Here's the thing, by Imperial Guard standards, a standard Krieg infantryman is already exceptional. These soldiers are proficient in all basic weaponry including laser guns, grenades, and explosives, but they also excel at rapid construction of effective trench works. Drop a Krieg infantry regiment into any position and within hours they'll have dug fortifications that would take other regiments days to complete. The ability to fight and fortify simultaneously is what makes Krieg infantry fundamentally different from Cadians or Cadetians or any other Guard regiment. The 127th embodies the psychological framework that produces soldiers disdainful of retreat or surrender. These Guardsmen view their deaths as meaningful penance for ancestral sins and spiritual obligations to the Emperor. That's not propaganda, that's genuine belief drilled into every soldier from childhood in the underground hive cities of Krieg. They don't fear death, they expect it. This psychological conditioning produces combat performance that breaks every normal assumption about morale and casualty thresholds. Other Imperial Guard regiments start losing effectiveness after 20% casualties. Krieg regiments continue fighting at full intensity past 50% losses. The 127th will absorb casualties that would shatter any other unit and simply keep advancing. Commissars assigned to Krieg regiments have to prevent suicidal charges that waste lives without tactical gain. The 127th provides the foundational combat power that distinguishes Death Corps as fundamentally infantry-centric. Tanks support the infantry. Artillery prepares positions for the infantry. Everything exists to enable these soldiers to close with the enemy, occupy ground, and hold it regardless of cost. But if you think standard infantry willing to die without hesitation is disturbing, the 616th takes that mindset and adds an entire regiment of fresh reinforcements who never even made it to their original deployment. 616th Infantry Regiment. Here's the thing about Krieg. The planet doesn't just produce regiments, it produces them on an industrial scale, turning out fresh formations faster than the administratum can deploy them. Multiple regiments were raised as reinforcements for the Siege of Vrax, trained for the meat grinder, equipped for 17 years of grinding attrition warfare. And then some got diverted to other war zones before they ever reached Vrax, which tells you everything about how the Imperium views Death Corps soldiers. They're not people, they're assets, interchangeable units on a spreadsheet. Vrax needed bodies, raise new regiments. Different war zone needs bodies before those regiments ship out, redirect them mid-deployment. The soldiers don't get a say. They don't care. Their entire culture revolves around dying for the Emperor wherever they're pointed. The Death Corps maintains hundreds of active regiment designations at any given time. Regiments deployed to Vrax arrived in waves across decades of conflict, with formations numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The planet never stops recruiting, never stops training, never stops producing soldiers who view military service as the only pace to redemption, because that's what Krieg society is. A military production line wrapped in religious obligation. Every citizen understands that their world committed unforgivable sins during the Civil War, and the only way to earn the Emperor's forgiveness is through service and sacrifice. The entire planetary economy, culture, and and social structure exists to produce regiments. Regiments trained for siege, warfare, expecting wrecks, then get sent to completely different operational theaters with different enemies and different tactical requirements. But they adapt because that's what Krieg soldiers do. They don't question, they don't complain, they execute orders until they die, and they will die. Replacement regiments have shorter life expectancies than veteran formations. They're filling gaps created by other units' casualties. The administratum's calculus is simple. Warzone needs soldiers. Krieg produces soldiers. Deploy soldiers. Repeat until Warzone is pacified or completely destroyed, but at least they're filling a tactical role, unlike the Grenadiers who get the worst assignments imaginable. 5th Siege Regiment. The 5th Siege Regiment is the template. This is what people picture when they think Krieg Siege Regiment. Every single element refined through 500 years of civil war into standardized doctrine. Artillery, infantry, armor, cavalry, all combined into one integrated fighting force, designed to reduce fortifications through overwhelming firepower and bodies. Here's what that looks like in practice. The regimental structure incorporates line infantry squads for holding ground, grenadier shock troops for breaching defenses, combat engineer detachments for tunnel warfare and demolitions, and supporting armor elements that provide mobile fire support. Everything working together under unified command. No independent operations, no tactical creativity, just synchronized firepower and coordinated infantry assaults. The organization isn't clever, it's optimized, and that optimization came from Krieg's own 5th-century civil war. Defenders learned to hold positions despite overwhelming bombardment. Attackers learned to reduce fortifications through combined arms and patient preparation. Both sides refined their approaches until there were no shortcuts left, only proven methods that worked through superior firepower and willingness to absorb casualties. The 5th represents that accumulated experience codified into doctrine. The methodology emphasizes careful preparation, engineer support, and bodies. When the 5th deploys against a fortified position, they don't look for clever tactical alternatives. They calculate how much artillery preparation is required, how many engineer saps need to reach the target, and how many infantry waves are necessary to secure the objective. Then they execute. The casualties are factored into the plan from the beginning, not treated as unexpected complications. This is siege warfare as Krieg understands it. There are no shortcuts, there is firepower, there are fortifications, and there are soldiers willing to cross the ground between them until the objective falls. The 5th embodies that philosophy completely. Every regiment learns from this template. Every siege army builds on this foundation. But if you think standard siege doctrine is brutal, wait until you see what happens when a regiment gets specialized for specific environments. 261st Siege Regiment. The 261st Siege Regiment exists. It fought at Brock's under Colonel Tyborg. Beyond that, documentation gets scarce. The 261st appears in official records, but it's one line in a casualty list, not a featured narrative. It has a number, it has a commander's name preserved in the archives, and it participated in one of the longest, bloodiest campaigns in Imperial Guard history without getting more than a passing mention. Here's the thing about the Death Corps. For every famous 143rd conducting 17-year sieges that get turned into multi-volume Imperial armor books, there are dozens of regiments like the 261st dying in the same battles without getting a single paragraph dedicated to their individual actions. These regiments still follow standard Krieg patterns. They still maintain line infantry, grenadier elements, combat engineers, armor support, and integrated artillery. They still prosecute grinding wars of attrition with the same grim determination that defines every Death Corps formation. They just do it without a chronicler focusing on them specifically. The tragedy isn't that the 261st lacks impressive battle honors. The tragedy is that it fought at Breaks, one of the most extensively documented Death Corps campaigns in Imperial records, and still barely rates a mention. Somewhere in that 17-year meat grinder, the 261st reduced fortifications through months of tunnel warfare. The 261st held trench lines against overwhelming enemy assault. Colonel Tyborg made tactical decisions that kept his regiment fighting. Almost none of it made it into the published narrative beyond confirmation that the regiment was there. The 261st represents the documentation reality of Krieg military operations. The Imperium doesn't just deploy 1 or 2 siege regiments to major campaigns, it deploys dozens. Most of them will participate in the same battles, suffer the same casualties, demonstrate the same grim competence, and receive a fraction of the attention. Your regiment gets a designation, a commander's name in the records, and orders to deploy. Whether anyone gives you more than a footnote depends entirely on narrative focus, not your extra contribution. At least the 261st got its name and commander preserved in the proxy documentation. That's more than many regiments fighting the same campaign can say. But if you think being a footnote in your own siege is frustrating, wait until you hear about the one regiment that did get extensive coverage, and it turned into one of the longest, most exhaustively documented documented meat grinders in Imperial Guard history, 143rd Siege Regiment. The 143rd is the poster boy, the regiment that defines what Krieg means to everyone who's ever looked at a Warhammer 40K model or watched a lore video. When you picture the Death Korps, you're picturing the 143rd. Blue jackets, gas masks, trenches, and grim silence. That's them. The 143rd marched onto transport ships in 812, M41 heading to Vrax Prime. They were part of the initial spearhead of the 88th Siege Army, the first wave hitting the beach in what the Administratum thought would be a 12-year siege. It turned into 17. The 143rd became synonymous with the entire campaign. When people reference Vrax, they're referencing the 143rd. When they paint Death Korps miniatures, they're painting the 143rd's blue jacket scheme. The regiment didn't just fight at Vrax. It became Vrax in the cultural memory of the community. The combat experience was exactly what you'd expect from Krieg. Vicious tank battles on crater plains, desperate assaults against fortifications engineered to withstand grinding siege warfare, heavy shelling that turned entire grid squares into radioactive ash. The 143rd experienced all of it, survived all of it, and kept advancing, because that's what Krieg does. But here's the thing that makes the 143rd unique beyond their combat record. Their blue jacket color scheme has effectively become the canonical appearance for Death Korps, despite official acknowledgement that regimental colors vary based on available supplies and environmental factors. The lore explicitly states that cloth and dye availability determines regimental appearance, with grays, blacks, greens, and browns being most common. But the community collectively decided that blue jackets are what Krieg looks like, because that's what the 143rd wore. And the 143rd is the only regiment most people have ever heard of. This creates both icon and burden. Paint your models with green jackets? Someone will tell you that's not accurate, even though it absolutely is. Reference a different regiment's combat doctrine? Someone will correct you based on what the 143rd did at Vrax, as if that's the only valid Krieg experience. The 143rd didn't just become famous, they became definitional, which means every other regiment exists in their shadow. The 143rd's aesthetic dominance is so complete that some newer hobbyists genuinely don't realize other color schemes exist, or assume variations are fan inventions rather than equally valid canonical options. But if you think one regiment defining an entire faction's visual identity is restrictive, wait until you see how the entire army structure functions when deployed at scale. 88th Siege Army. This is it, the ultimate expression of Krieg warfare. Not a regiment, not a division, but an entire army committed to 17 years of grinding siege. 200,000 soldiers. That's not a typo. That's just the starting point. The 88th Siege Army was composed of 4-line corps, each consisting of 4 regiments, totaling approximately 200,000 guardsmen of the Death Korps of Krieg when they marched up those boarding ramps in 812 M41. The Administratum calculates 12 standard years required to prosecute the siege of Vrax. The actual campaign lasted 17 Terran years. The Administratum knew it would take over a decade and millions of lives, and they committed anyway. This is what Krieg was made for. Vrax Prime served as a fortress overblessed with arms and ammunition sufficient to supply armies for decades, protected by countless trenches and ferrocrete bunkers that stretched across the entire planetary surface. The operational plan involved repeated offenses on 2 fronts to reduce defenses and recapture the citadel through grinding attrition. No clever tactics, no flanking maneuvers, just math. We have more bodies than you have bullets, and we're willing to prove it. The Death Korps stalled rebel advances despite encirclement, launched desperate assaults when surrounded, and conducted vicious tank battles across cratered plains over multiple years. Tank crews fought on landscapes so devastated by artillery that navigation became impossible without constant surveyor support. Infantry advanced through trenches filled with the bodies of previous assaults. Engineers dug tunnels for months only to detonate them and start over when enemy countermining collapsed the shafts. This went on for 17 years. The scale is almost incomprehensible. 12 years was the optimistic estimate. 17 years was reality. Entire generations of Krieg soldiers were born, trained as deployed to Vrax, and died without ever seeing another world. Officers who arrived as young men retired as broken veterans, replaced by fresh commanders who inherited battlefields they could barely recognize from outdated maps. The 88th Siege Army became a self-sustaining military ecosystem, consuming reinforcements and producing casualties at industrial scale. Here's where it gets dark. The Administratum calculated all of this in advance. They knew the timeline. They knew the casualty projections. They approved it anyway because Vrax held enough munitions to supply her radical forces for decades, and the Imperium could not permit that strategic resource to remain in enemy hands. 200,000 Krieg soldiers was considered an acceptable down payment. The millions who died afterward were just interest on the loan. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.